The hearing will please come to order. When we last recessed, Mr. Eagleson was questioning the witness. Just to remind the witness that you're still under oath.
Yes, sir.
Before proceeding, Senator Rudman has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to direct a question to counsel for the House Committee, Mr. Neal. I believe that it's been 2 weeks since General Secord testified, and at the time he was asked whether or not he would consider giving us the waiver to look at those bank records. I also asked him whether he might return that money, which is approximately $8 million. I'm particularly interested in the waiver because if General Secord's testimony was candid and truthful, I would expect those records would verify what he testified to. So my question to Mr. Neal is, one, do we have the waiver? Two, do we have the money?
We do not have the waiver. Mr. Secord has not advised the committees yet whether he will execute the waiver, and we do not have the money.
I thank you very much, Mr. Neal, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Eagleson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Owen, last Thursday when you were testifying before the committee, you testified to a number of different trips that you took to Central America, meetings that you had with Colonel North, with Mr. Calero and others. I take it that during the course of your testimony, you were not testifying to all of the meetings that you had or all of the trips that you took to Central America. Is that correct?
No, sir, I was not.
And Mr. Owen, you also testified on Thursday to a number of different payments that you made to various Contra leaders. And I think that you testified to a series of different ones. Let me ask you a slightly different question. Do you know how many Contra leaders you paid in total? How many different leaders you paid?
If you can wait a minute, let me count in just in my head.
Okay.
Somewhere between 6 and 10, and I think the word leader can be used in a variety of different terms.
And what is the total amount of money that you think you paid, the money that you received from Colonel North and then paid on?
Somewhere around $30,000, more or less.
You also, I think, testified to a particular event which took place outside of the old executive office building where you paid money through the window of a car. And I think that you testified at that time that there was an American in the car and you thought that he knew the purpose of the payment, and also you thought he might have known that it came from Colonel North. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes, sir, I do.
And who was the American who was in the car?
I can't remember right offhand. I'll think about it, and during the testimony it will probably come to me. I'm sorry.
Do you recall his position?
He was with a conservative activist group in town. It was either Citizens for Reagan or Citizens for America. I believe his name was Peter Flaherty.
You also testified about the method by which Colonel North got the traveler's checks from Mr. Calero, and I think your testimony was that you did not personally, as best you knew, carry any money between Calero, or traveler's checks between Calero and Colonel North. Are you certain about that testimony?
Over the weekend, I obviously had a great deal of time to think about it, and there may have been 1 or 2 occasions when I did bring up an envelope. I did not necessarily know that there were traveler's checks in it, but there may well have been, and I just can't say one way or the other.
And just one more question on this payment issue. Did Colonel North have a method by which he kept track of the amount of traveler's checks that he was giving to you?
Yes, sir. He had a ledger that he kept track of every traveler's check that he gave me, from the serial numbers to the amount and where it was going. And I would just like to add here that there have been a lot of reports in the press, but Adolfo Calero, to the best of my knowledge, provided the traveler's checks to Oliver North. Oliver North then either had me or potentially someone else that I don't know about distribute it to Contra leaders. So it was, if you will, Contra money going from one leader to another with an intermediary.
Let me stay on the ledger for a moment. This was a fairly detailed ledger, is that correct?
To the best of my knowledge, I never really saw it.
When is the last time that you saw the ledger?
I don't even remember. Probably the last time I got money, and I don't remember when that was.
Would that have been in 1985?
Yes.
And you don't know where the ledger is today?
No, sir.
You are aware that it was not located in Colonel North's office?
I was not aware of that.
Do you know whether Mr. Calero knew the purpose for which he was providing the funds to Colonel North?
That I don't know.
Mr. Owen, let me direct your attention to August of 1985, late August. At that time, did you take a trip to Costa Rica?
Yes, sir, I did.
And on whose instructions did you take that trip?
Colonel North's.
And what was the purpose of the trip that you took in late August of '85?
There was the belief that an airfield would need to be found in Costa Rica that could be used either as a staging point or to provide an emergency landing strip should a plane get in trouble if it was shot at while flying over Nicaragua.
And so the purpose of your trip was to determine whether there was a location where an airfield could be built?
Yes, sir.
And I take it the airfield would be built in connection with lethal drops?
I believe it was for both lethal and non-lethal.
And did you in fact go to Costa Rica for that purpose?
Yes, sir, I did, and I wrote a memo to Colonel North on that.
You wrote a memo to Colonel North?
Yes.
Is that memo if you could turn to RWO-9.
Excuse me.
Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, that's the memo.
This is the memorandum that you wrote to Colonel North after returning from Costa Rica?
Yes, sir.
Would you just describe generally when you got to Costa Rica who from the United States government you talked to about the operation?
I was met by a senior agency representative who picked me up at the airport. We then had several meetings that evening, and the next day he and I attended a meeting with a Costa Rican official.
And the purpose was to find a location?
Yes, sir. I was introduced as a private citizen who was interested in helping the cause of the Nicaraguan freedom fighters. I do not believe that the Costa Rican official knew that I was working directly for or with Colonel North, and we did have a conversation. 2 sites were suggested and 1 was decided upon after I went and visited it.
You actually took a trip out to the site?
Yes, sir. I went with the CIA official, myself, and a Costa Rican official.
Are there any other American officials to whom you spoke when you were down there about the airfield?
Sir, I can't remember, but I may have spoken with Ambassador Lou Tams.
I'm sorry, Ambassador Lou Tams?
Yes, sir. He was the U.S. ambassador to Costa Rica at
that time. And on return from the trip, this RWO-9 is the memorandum that you prepared for Colonel North. Would it...
Sure. Yes, sir, it is.
Would it be fair to say that this memo summarizes in some detail the various logistical and cost and various other kinds of problems that would arise out of establishing this airfield in Costa Rica?
Yes, sir. I also brought back snapshots that I took while I was out visiting the airfield, and then they were used to look at it and decide whether it would be the proper place.
This memorandum includes information about the location of the field, is that right?
I'm not sure that specifically. I know I brought back a map locating it with this location.
And at least the memo talks about various improvements that would have to be made to the property?
Yes, sir. It was decided what would needed to be done, a clearing of the runway. There was a second runway which already was in existence, and that would be used for small planes near a house that would be on the main road.
You also talk in your memo, do you not, about the need for a cover operation to cover the airfield. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. We felt it was very important that one be in existence. Costa Rica is a neutral country, and at that time, obviously, there was no exposure to this operation, and we felt that that was the best way to keep it was to set up a cover.
And did you have conversations with Colonel North about setting up offshore accounts?
Yes, I did.
And a Panamanian company in order to cover this operation?
Yes, I did, but I believe that may already have been underway. I'm not sure, though.
Did you take any specific steps in order to get the offshore accounts established?
I had a meeting with a lawyer here in Washington, D.C., and asked him to draw up various ways that money could be, if you will, moved about overseas.
And did you report the results of that conversation to Colonel North?
I gave a copy of the letter that I received from the lawyer to Colonel North.
And was there discussion of establishing a specific corporation? Do you remember the name of the corporation that was going to be used as the cover?
No, I did not, but I subsequently learned that it was Udall Corporation.
Udall Corporation?
Yes, sir.
Does there come a time in the fall of 1985 when you're essentially taken off this project by Colonel North?
Yes, sir, there was. Colonel North and I had a discussion. The thought was where I best could be used to continue with helping as best that I could in the program. At that time, the Nicaraguan Humanitarian Assistance Office had been started, and the thought was that maybe I would be able to do more there than I would be able to do with the airfield.
And the Nicaraguan Humanitarian Assistance Office was something that was established following the time Congress passed the humanitarian aid in August of 1985?
Yes, sir, it was.
And was the person who was in charge of that Ambassador Doomling?
Yes, sir, it was.
And did he have a deputy?
Yes.
What was his name?
Chris Arcos.
Before I get to that, let me ask you, Mr. Owen, you've testified about a variety of different things that you did on behalf of Colonel North in support of the Contras. You also had a small role in the third country funding of the Contras, did you not?
Yes, sir, I did.
And does there come a time in the fall or summer and fall of 1985 when you have conversations with Colonel North about solicitation of third countries?
Yes, sir, Colonel North invited me over to his office. He said that there was a third country, I believe in your chronology, it's country number 3, which was willing to provide some assistance, and he asked me to take an envelope over and meet with an official from country number 3 and provide him with the envelope.
Did Colonel North tell you what was inside the envelope?
He did. It was a bank account number.
Did he tell you, if you recall, where the bank account was located?
He may have mentioned Switzerland, but I don't remember.
Did you ever see inside the envelope?
No, sir, I did not.
And did you then meet with the representative of country 3?
Yes, sir, I called and set up an appointment and went over and spent a few minutes with him.
Did you have a conversation with him?
Yes, sir, I did.
Did you speak about the Contras with him?
Yes, sir, I told him that I was a private citizen. I was not representing the United States government. I told him that whatever assistance his country could be to help the Nicaraguan freedom fighters would certainly be appreciated by those people who were down there, and I knew, at least I thought it would be appreciated by our government.
And so you provided him with the envelope?
Yes, sir, I did.
Did you ever learn whether or not the representative of country 3 or whether country 3 had made a contribution?
No, I did not learn that.
Immediately before the time you testified last week, Mr. Gaston Segur testified. Did you have occasion to hear any of his testimony?
Yes, I did.
He, if you recall, testified that in the fall of '85, Colonel North called him and asked him to, quote, call this particular official of Country 3 and say that someone on behalf of the Contras would go and talk to him and tell him how the funds should be transmitted. Do you happen to recall that testimony by Dr. Segur?
I wasn't listening at that time, so I don't remember it.
In any event, from what you know, you probably are the representative of Country 3 who did the meeting. Is that
Yes,
correct?
sir, and Gaston Segur's name had been mentioned to me.
Mr. Segur's name was mentioned during the course of your conversation with the representative of Country 3?
I believe so, yes.
Mr. Owen, in the fall, September and October of 1985, did you have occasion to take trips up to New York at the instructions of Colonel North?
The first time I went, it was not at the instruction of Colonel North. But yes, I took 3 trips to New York.
And the first time, did there come a time when you went up on a bank holiday?
Yes, on September 16th, I believe it was Rosh Hashanah, and the banks were closed. I was asked to go up there.
And you were asked to go by Colonel North?
No, Colonel North gave me a phone number to call and a person to ask for, and that person was Mr. Kopp, who obviously was Mr. Secord.
Did you know at that time he was Mr. Secord?
I had a very good idea, yes.
And did you I take it, then had a conversation with Secord?
Yes, sir, I did. He gave me instructions, the address, and in essence, a code to use when I went and approached the person.
Where did you go?
I flew up to New York, and I took a cab down to the Lower West Side, and I was instructed to go to a corner Chinese market.
And you went to the market?
Yes, sir.
Did you give a code name?
I asked for the person, I don't remember his name, and then I said that I used the code name saying this person sent me, and I'm afraid I don't remember. I think it was something like Mui or something along those lines.
Did that person then give you anything?
Yes, he did. He walked behind the counter. I believe he rolled up his pant leg and pulled out a wad of $100 bills. Not I believe, I know he pulled out a wad of $100 bills.
Did he give a part of this wad to you?
He gave the whole wad to me and asked me if I wanted to count it. I did not know how much I was supposed to be getting, but I decided I better count it anyways.
And how many $100 bills did he give you?
There were 95. It was $9,500.
After getting the bills from him, the $9,500 in cash, did you return to D.C.?
Yes, I did.
And did you meet with General Secord?
Yes, I did. I was told that he would be waiting for me at the Sheraton Carlton. I went into the lobby. I saw him sitting in the bar. I went downstairs, used a house phone and called the bar and asked to speak with him. And then I met him in the lobby.
Did you give him the cash?
Yes, sir, I did. I had folded it in a newspaper and handed him the newspaper.
Did you know the reason that you took this trip?
I just knew that obviously they were short of cash and they must have needed it, and it was a bank holiday, and this was the easiest way for them to get it.
But you do not know, you were not told the reason that they needed this $9,500 in cash?
No, sir, I was not.
Did you have any conversation with General Secord about the reason that the amount was only $9,500?
Yes, sir. I suggested to Mr. Secord that perhaps the money changer had taken his 5%, and he said no. You assured me that that was to stay within the legal law so that no more than $10,000 was transmitted in one transaction. So they kept it under the $10,000, so it would not have to be reported.
You understood that there were some reporting requirements when people deal in amounts of cash in excess of $10,000?
Yes, sir, and every time I would travel to Central America, there were always large signs posted saying that if you have $10,000 or more that you're taking in or bringing out, you have to declare it.
Did you take any other trips to New York in order to obtain cash?
Yes, I took 2 more.
And on whose instructions did you take those trips?
Again, General Secord's.
And did you have conversations with Colonel North before taking those trips?
Yes, I did.
Is it actually Colonel North who asked you to take the trips?
I guess that's questionable. I mean, it was both for Colonel North and General Secord.
How did you get the money on those occasions?
I went to a bank which was, I think, in the mid-40s in Manhattan, and I went up to the 6th floor. Unfortunately, I don't remember the name of the bank. Asked for a person whose name I had been given and told them that I was expected to pick up an envelope, and they provided me with an envelope each time.
Do you remember the name of the person who you were to speak to?
No, sir.
And did you see inside the envelope?
No, sir, I did not.
It was sealed at the time you got it?
Yes, it was.
And did you have to sign any receipt for it?
No.
That you were simply handed the envelope filled with cash or whatever was in it?
Yes, and I can't necessarily testify that it was cash because I didn't know, but it certainly felt the same shape and size.
And on those 2 occasions, after getting the envelopes from the bank, the person at the bank, what did you do with the envelopes?
I returned to Washington, and on these 2 occasions, I believe I took the envelopes to Colonel North in his office.
Now, you have earlier testified that you began to think that you would be more helpful with NHAO, the Nicaraguan Humanitarian Assistance Organization. Does there come a time when you become employed by NHAO?
Yes, sir. I had a letter was sent on September 3rd by Evanor Valdivia of the United Nicaraguan Opposition. He at that time was General Secretary, requesting that I be brought on NHAO. I did have several meetings with Ambassador Dumling. I also met with Chris Arcos. The first meeting was in September at some time. It was very congenial. He was not sure how I might be able to help. Then we had, I think, another meeting in October, and towards the end of October, I received a phone call from him saying that he would like to meet with me, and he thought something could be worked out where I could help.
Was there a period of time in there when he did not want to hire you?
I think he was reluctant. He wasn't quite sure how I would be able to help out. I think he also felt that he may have been receiving undue pressure from possibly Colonel North or others to bring me on board.
Do you know who besides Colonel...
Excuse me, sir. Okay. Yes, sir.
Do you know who besides Colonel North was pressuring him to hire you?
I don't know whether anyone was pressuring him. My understanding was that the decision to hire me was made at the RIG, which was the interagency group. I think at that time it was made up of Colonel North, Elliot Abrams, and the director of the Central American Task Force for the CIA. But I don't know that for a fact. I just was told that.
Did any Contra leaders advocate to Ambassador Dumling that you should be hired?
Yes, sir. In October, a letter was signed by all 3, Alfonso Robelo, Arturo Cruz, and Adolfo Calero, asking Ambassador Dumling that he retain IDEA, the Institute for Democracy, Education, and Assistance, a nonprofit 501c3 organization, to help with the disbursement of humanitarian assistance.
Was IDEA a nonprofit organization that you had set up?
Yes, sir. I set it up. I set that up in January 1985. At the same time, I had set up a 501c4, which is a lobbying organization called the Council for Democracy, Education, and Assistance.
And it was through IDEA and then that the contract was obtained, and it was part of the contract that you were to do the work on behalf of IDEA. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. So I was just employed by IDEA, and IDEA had the contract with NHAO.
And I take it then, following the time you began with NHAO, you began to take a series of trips on behalf of that organization down to Central America.
Yes, sir, I did.
And did you also take trips, let me move you forward to February of 1986. Do you recall taking 2 trips down to Central America in February of 1986?
Not right offhand, but I'm sure I did. I mean, obviously I did, but I just don't know the dates, and I'm not sure which ones you're referring to.
Let me direct your attention to RWO-11.
I haven't.
Was this a memo that you wrote to Colonel North?
Yes, sir, it is.
And actually, at the beginning, it says 2:BG.
Yes, sir.
What does BG stand for?
I was afraid you were going to ask me. It was a nickname we gave Colonel North.
And what did the BG stand for?
Blood and guts.
And again, you have used your nickname, which is the Courier.
That's right.
This memorandum, though, does it not speak about a list of items that Negro would like to have?
Yes, sir, it does.
Just a moment. Why can't I just use this? This memorandum makes a reference to various items that Negro needs. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, it does.
And Negro is whom?
Negro Chamorro, who was at that time the leader of the Southern Front, the military commander of the Southern Front.
And let me direct your attention to RWO-12. Is this another memorandum that you wrote to BG following a trip that you took to Central America?
Yes, sir, it is.
And on page 2 of this memorandum, about halfway down, it refers to lethal supplies that are still required.
Yes, sir.
And it refers to Negro's people who are still waiting for a drop of lethal equipment. Is that right?
Yes, sir, it does.
This is information that you are providing back to Colonel North?
Yes, sir, it's intelligence that I was providing for Colonel North. I felt it incumbent upon me to keep him as fully informed of all aspects, because he was a representative of the National Security Council and he was deeply involved in what was going on.
Well, Mr. Owen, it's a little more than that, isn't it? At the end of the line I just mentioned about the lethal equipment for Negro, it says, quote, advise you check on where this stands. Do you see that?
Yes.
So, in fact, at the time you were writing this memorandum, you anticipated, and I take it that the Contra leaders anticipated, that he would do something in order to help out getting this lethal drop down to Negro Chamorro. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
In March of 1986, you take an additional trip to Central America?
Yes, I do.
And prior to the time that you go down, do you have occasion to meet with Colonel North?
Yes, sir, I was called into Colonel North's office.
And you had a conversation with him about a trip that you were to take?
Yes, there was a flight leaving Dulles Airport, an L-100, which was chartered through Southern Air Transport. It was loaded with medical supplies, and it was going down to the Nicaraguan Resistance Air Base in Central America.
And did Colonel North advise that you take that flight down?
Yes, sir, he did.
Was there something going to happen with that particular airplane after it arrived down and unloaded the medical supplies.
Yes, sir. He asked me that once I had completed and overseen the unloading of the medical supplies and provided a list to the doctors that were receiving it, as well as talking with them about whatever problems may exist, that I then let me rephrase that I then help put together the reloading of the L-100.
And what did you talk about with Colonel North that would be reloaded on the L-100?
There was a list of munitions that were going to be reloaded in the L-100.
And where were they going to go?
They were going to go to another air base in Central America where they would be packaged and palletized for a drop into Nicaragua.
And you were going to help in the reloading and repalletizing process?
Sir, this was a one-time thing, if I may. Neither the pilots nor the crew in the aircraft or the others that were on it had been down to the region, or if they had, they hadn't been involved in something like this. Colonel North asked me to accompany him because I knew the players and knew the various people involved.
Well, it may have been a one-time thing, Mr. Owen, but nevertheless, at Colonel North's request, you did, in fact, accompany this flight down. Is that right?
Yes, sir, I did.
And when you got down to Central America and after unloading the humanitarian supplies, was there a problem about the lethal equipment?
Yes, sir, I had raised this with Colonel North before I went. As usual, Murphy's Law held. We arrived at the air base. The lethal supplies were not there, were not ready to be loaded up, and this was a concern that he had, so I went and talked with a CIA officer who was at the base, asked him if he knew anything about it. He did not. I talked to the Nicaraguans who were there. I asked them if they knew anything about it. They did not. I then subsequently asked the CIA officer to through secure communications, contact Tegucigalpa and their base.
You asked him to do what?
I asked him through his secure communications to contact his base station in Tegucigalpa and then to subsequently relay a question to one of the senior CIA officials in the country.
And the purpose of this communication was to determine whether or not munitions could be released to be placed on the aircraft?
Yes, sir. It was my understanding that the FDN had agreed to release these materials. They were supposed to be there waiting for us. They were not. There were occasions when CIA officials could help encourage the FDN to do some things they otherwise might not do. And it was my understanding that they probably had talked with him already about the release of this equipment. The message I got back was that the material was not released.
Did you fly on to the next air base?
Yes, sir. The plane loaded up empty. We flew over to the next air base where we were met, and a series of phone calls and communications took place to try and find out if this could be sorted out. The drop had been scheduled for the following night.
And when you say a series of phone calls were made, to whom were those phone calls made?
There were phone calls made back to Washington, to Colonel North, to, I believe, to General Secord, and to also, I believe, Mr. Richard Gadd.
And Richard Gadd at that time was whom?
Richard Gadd was the one responsible, or I should say, having oversight of the leasing of the aircraft. He was both leasing for NHAO and he was involved in the covert air operation to resupply the Contras.
Did the phone calls have any success?
They met with a great deal of frustration. I believe a series of phone calls were placed also to Honduras from Washington, but finally after I think the better part of a day, a decision was made that we would scrub the mission.
And when you say phone calls were made, other than to Colonel North and Gadd and General Secord, were there calls made to any other United States government officials?
Yes, sir. I placed a call to the senior CIA officer in Costa Rica.
And that was also fruitless, I take it.
It was, but that was more to tell him so that he could pass on the word to the freedom fighters who were in the jungles waiting for the drop to let them know that the mission was not a go.
Who all was meeting at the second air base in order to try to get this lethal drop organized?
Sir, can I ask you to refer to a memo that I believe may be one of the documents?
Which, are you referring to RWO-14?
Yes, sir. I only did that so I could refresh my memory.
Okay.
Sitting in on the meetings was Felix Rodriguez, who was it was his nom de guerre, or I should say Max Gomez was his nom de guerre, Felix Rodriguez was his real name, Colonel Jim Steele, who was the Mill Group commander, Chichi Quintero, who was a representative of General Secord, and myself.
And those are the people who met and tried to get this lethal drop organized, is that correct?
Yes, sir. Colonel Steele more sat in as an observer, but he did place, we asked him to place one call on a secure line to the CIA offices in the country that we had come from.
Now, is it true that your contract with NHAO specifically precluded you from doing anything with regard to the transportation or facilitation of lethal supplies?
There was a section in there which did say that. I might add right here, though, that I believe since I had completed my NHAO work on that delivery of medical supplies, that I was on my own time, and I was also doing this at the direction of the National Security Council and an advisor who I believed was working under the auspices of the President of the United States.
Well, let me ask you this. Did you tell Ambassador Doomling that you had taken off your NHAO hat and decided to participate or help facilitate a lethal airdrop?
He never asked, and I never told him.
And you never told his deputy, Mr. Arcos, either, I take it?
No, sir, I did not.
And do you think that if they had known that you had tried to facilitate this drop, that you would have been reprimanded, if not fired?
That was really not what I was worried about. I was more concerned that should I do that, it would start, if you will, exposing the layers of a covert operation that was set up to resupply the Nicaraguan resistance.
Well, but just in answer to my question, I take it that they would not have been pleased if they'd learned that you had had participation in this.
I think Ambassador Doomling would have been disappointed and rather upset.
Part of the memo that you just referred to as RWO-14 makes a reference to the need for secure communications devices.
Yes, sir.
And does there come a time in the spring of '86 when you helped facilitate this memo and provide secure devices?
Yes, I believe in April of '86, I was provided a KL-41, I believe is the name of it. Excuse me, KL-43 by Colonel North, and I took it on one of my trips to Costa Rica, where I provided it to a senior CIA official.
And who else, to your knowledge, had the devices?
It was my understanding that, if I can just backtrack for a minute, during this flight where we tried to deliver the lethal supplies, there was no secure communication, so everything was done over an open line. It was felt that that was totally inappropriate because the Cubans and the Soviets were listening in probably to all communications. And in my memo, I suggested that secure communications should be set up. And I believe that, certainly from General Secord's testimony, I learned that Chichi Quintero had one, that probably Felix Rodriguez had one. I knew that Colonel North had one, that General Secord had one, and that Dick Gadd had one.
Did you have one?
No, sir, I did not.
Mr. Owen, by May of 1986, it's true, is it not, that the NHAO funding started to run out?
Yes, sir. My understanding is that initially Congress appropriated the funds through March 31st, but there were funds remaining, and it was decided, I guess through the rig, that those funds could be expended. They had already been allocated, and by the end of May, my funds had run out.
And does it come a time around the same time when you start to essentially extricate yourself from the Central American situation?
Yes, sir. There was, Colonel North and I had several discussions, as my memos show, where I was concerned about my exposure, and through my exposure, his exposure, because I did not want to jeopardize what he was doing by my desire to try and stay on and continue to help the resistance. And I felt it was better at this time probably to get out while getting out was still good.
Is it true that as of this time your name was becoming publicly associated with the Contra effort?
Yes, sir. I believe in the first week in June, the Miami Herald ran a long article discussing my involvement. Also, a number of reporters have been talking with NHAO and various State Department people and asking questions about me, and I believe my name had been raised in a House resolution asking Colonel North what he knew about me, as well as several others.
Before I get to that, let me just ask you some questions about some conversations that you might have had with various people in the summer of 1986. Do you recall any conversations with General Secord or Colonel North or anyone about what was going to happen to the assets that have been accumulated in Central America following the passage of the aid?
After I completed my tour with NHAO, and I in essence phased myself out, or was phased out of helping the Nicaraguan resistance, I still would meet with Colonel North from time to time, and we would have conversations. I think on occasion he did discuss that, and he was concerned that the CIA would not take advantage of all these assets that they had. And from my best of my recollection, he said, look, we even want to give it to them, and they don't want to touch it. I had another meeting with General Secord at some point, and he said much the same thing.
Do you recall a meeting that you had with General Secord in or about September of 1986?
Yes, sir.
And did you discuss a number of different items relating to the kind of the history of your and his involvement in the Contra resistance in that meeting?
A variety of topics were covered. Certainly those are among them.
Do you recall any discussion at that meeting with General Secord about his participation in the solicitation of Country 2?
Yes, sir. He told me that he had met with Prince Bandar before King Fahd came to visit the president, and he had asked him for assistance. He then mentioned at some point that he thought they had given $15 million because of that meeting.
Do you recall any discussion with him about another topic? Let me ask you, was there anything you recall of discussion with him about the decision in the summer of '85 to take the funding away from Mr. Calero?
Yes, sir. There was a conversation about that, and also I believe I'd had a couple of those with Colonel North. The decision was reached by, I believe, both Colonel North and General Secord that I think it was made on two reasons. It was potentially inappropriate that Adolfo Calero be using his brother Mario Calero to purchase goods. There had been a lot of rumors and speculation that some money was going where it shouldn't go. There was no proof, but the mere suggestion that that was the case was a concern. Colonel North always wanted the Nicaraguan resistance to be as clean as possible, and he was concerned about their image. Also, there was a concern that funds were being spent on things that probably were a waste of money, and I think he and General Secord felt they probably could do a better job.
So what decision was made? How was the procedure changed in the summer of '85?
My understanding, and I only can say it's my understanding, that as by the end of May, Adolfo Calero started getting concerned about funds, yet Colonel North at a later time obviously decided to use lake resources and use that for channeling funds. And
the thought was that Colonel North would maintain control then over the expenditure of the funds?
I think General Secord. I don't think Colonel North had signatory power over the banks.
And there was a decision then to provide Mr. Calero with items as opposed to just purely the money. Is that right?
There was always a concern that a black market existed, certainly in parts of Central America, on goods that were procured originally for the Contras. I think that they felt by providing by providing goods and services instead of money, that would negate a lot of that. So a decision was made to go with providing the goods. And I think, I may be mistaken, but I believe Colonel Adolfo Calero was provided with some funds, too, to take care of the needs that he had.
Mr. Owen, a moment ago you mentioned the resolution of inquiry which was issued by Congress in June of 1986. I think you indicated you were aware at or about the time that resolution of inquiry was issued?
Yes, someone made me aware of it.
In fact, the resolution of inquiry specifically mentioned you, did it not?
Yes, sir, it did.
And among other things, it asked about Colonel North's relationship with you?
Yes, it did.
And also his relationship with Mr. Hull?
Yes.
And I think as well a more general question about his relationship with various Contra leaders. Is that correct?
Yes, and I believe it also asked about his association with General Singlab.
Do you recall that there actually came a time when Colonel North met with members of Congress?
I believe he met with them in August of 1986.
And did you have any conversations with him prior to the time that he had that meeting about the way he was going to respond to those questions?
I don't think so. I did talk with him after he had those conversations.
You did have a conversation with him afterwards, after the meeting?
Yes, sir.
And did he say anything to you about what he had said to the members of Congress about his association with you?
Yes, he did. Colonel North at that time obviously was very busy, and I never wanted to take up much of his time. When I did get in to talk with him, I asked him if he had had the meeting. He said he had. He said that my name was brought up, and his comment to that question was, yes, I know Rob Owen. I've met him several times, but I think that was the extent of his remarks.
The resolution of inquiry also called for the production of various documents. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Do you know whether Colonel North provided to the members of Congress the various TC memos that you had provided to him?
I would doubt that he did. I think that that would be an exposure on his part.
And I take it similarly you don't believe that he advised them that you had carried maps down to the Contras on at least 3 occasions in late '84 and early 1985?
I don't believe he did.
And if Colonel North said that he had met with you several times, I take it that he had met with you quite a number of times by August of 1986. Is that correct?
I would say so. I have no idea the number, though.
Indeed, if you were to add up in his calendar for 1985, it appeared that you had about 20 or so meetings with him reflected in his calendar, and up until August of '86, about 20 or so additional meetings. Would that sound consistent with what you think probably happened?
Easily. We wouldn't always meet in his office. We'd meet in a variety of different places.
Is there a reason that you would sometimes meet outside of his office?
I was concerned that my showing up on his calendar too many times would be potentially detrimental and might be used at some point against him. And I think he had the same concern.
Because the people who are visiting the old executive office building are reflected on a computer for admissions purposes, is that the problem?
Yes, and each time you have to sign in and the computer keeps track.
And as a result, you met in other places, not just in the old executive office?
Yes, sir.
There had been a previous investigation of Colonel North in the summer of 1985. Were you aware of that?
Sir, I can't remember that one specifically, but I know there are a number of investigations that constantly involved Colonel North. We had some conversations about them. There were different times when he thought that he was probably going to be moved, and he said, I'll just let the chips fall where they may. Oftentimes when information came out, he and I would talk, and he said on several occasions that he would always be the fall guy if this story ever broke.
Let me ask you about that. Did Colonel North indicate to you whether or not his superiors at the NSC knew what it was that he was doing in Central America?
It was my understanding that he did. I was never given any clear indication. I once asked him what he did with my memos, and he said I'd take them across the street, and I just assumed that would probably go to the National Security Advisor, either Robert McFarland or John Poindexter. And
did he ever indicate to you whether or not the President knew what he and you were doing in Central America?
I don't think the President has time to know who Robert Owen is, but I imagine that he had an idea that Colonel North was doing things to help the Nicaraguan democratic resistance.
But you have no specific information about just what it was that the President may have known about Colonel North's activities?
No, I don't have specific information, but I was always under the assumption that he knew what he was doing, or at least had a general idea. He may not have gotten into the specifics.
There comes a time in October of 1985 when, or excuse me, October of 1986 when the plane carrying Mr. Hassan Fuss is shot down in Nicaragua. Where were you at that time?
I believe I was in Rhode Island for the weekend.
And did you ever have a conversation with Colonel North about Mr. Hassan Fuss and Mr. Buzz Sawyer, who was killed in that crash?
Yes, sir. I called Colonel North immediately as soon as I found out. My name was linked to the aircraft because a business card of mine was found in the wreckage. Buzz Sawyer was a personal friend of mine, and I felt very bad and hurt and concerned about his death. I knew his wife, and we'd had dinner on a couple occasions, and he had been over to my house. I think Buzz Sawyer was a true patriot to this country.
Did you want to go to his funeral?
Yes, sir, I did.
And did you go to his funeral?
No, I didn't. I asked Colonel North about it. I think probably one of the things I regret in all of this is that I didn't go to his funeral, but Colonel North, and I think possibly General Secord felt that it might be inappropriate because it would raise too many questions.
Mr. Owen, throughout particularly the spring of 1985, but throughout the time that you were involved in these various projects with Colonel North, at the time that you were standing on street corners making cash payments through open windows of cars, Did there come times when you would talk or joke with Colonel North about whether or not you were all going to go to jail for your activities?
There were a couple occasions that we would laugh about it and joke, yes.
You and Colonel North would joke about it?
Yes, and I hate to bring this poor person's name up again. I think he's already been through too much, but Jonathan Miller would also joke about it as well.
And was part of the reason that you would joke or talk about whether or not you were going to jail for your activities, was part of the reason the generally furtive and secretive nature of what it was that you were doing?
Sir, I'm not trained as a secret agent. I haven't been through any of this before. When you're involved in something that is new and different, from changing traveler's checks to traveling with documents to providing funds to different people, I think there's always a sense of nervousness about it. We were in a politically charged atmosphere. Obviously, the Congress was deeply divided. The feeling was that should our efforts be found out, there would be people who would want to try and find something illegal about it and probably try and throw us in jail. But quite frankly, in my personal view, I wasn't that concerned. If I was, I probably would have gone to talk to a lawyer about it. But I felt that I was working with a member of the National Security Council, someone who had access to the President of the United States, and believed it was the right thing to do.
It is true that you, was it not, you were not a government official,
That's right, I was not.
and you did not have a security clearance,
No, sir, I did not.
and you were essentially acting at that time as a private individual under the direction or under the guidance of a Marine Lieutenant Colonel who was the Deputy Director of the Office of Political Military Affairs at the NSC.
Well, in a way, but also, obviously, since I was being paid by Adolfo Calero, I was working with them, but I guess you could say that I probably did more for Colonel North than I did for Adolfo Calero.
Well, at the time you were making the payments to the Contra leaders, you were acting really at the request of Colonel North. Is that fair?
But they were Contra funds. They were not Colonel North's funds.
Nevertheless, it's not Adolfo Calero who asked you to make those payments. It was Colonel North.
Yes, sir.
And at the time that you took the maps down, it was because Colonel North provided them to you, not because Adolfo Calero had asked you for them.
Yes, sir.
And similarly, when you went up to New York and obtained the cash, it was because Colonel North and General Secord wanted you to do it, not because Adolfo Calero had specifically asked you to do it.
That's right.
And did you really regard yourself as a private individual who was acting in furtherance of a covert operation in Central America?
I guess you could say that. I was a private citizen who believed in what I was doing. I thought I was doing it certainly under the auspices of the United States government, but I was still a private citizen.
You indicated previously that you knew that, of course, that there was a Boland Amendment and that it had resulted from enormous discussion and debate and finally votes in both houses of the Congress. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
And would it be fair to say that you knew while you were acting with Colonel North that you and he, particularly Colonel North, knew that you were at the very least walking a very fine line between legality and illegality under the Boland Amendment?
Sir, the Boland Amendment did not affect me. I was a private citizen.
But nevertheless, you knew that Colonel North was concerned about the Boland Amendment, did you not?
I think he probably was because Congress was concerned about it, but I'm not sure that he believed the Boland Amendment affected him.
Well, let me ask you, do you recall giving a deposition in this matter?
Yes.
And do you recall being asked these questions and given these answers? Question, and was this because, and this is a reference to the jail conversations, and was this because of the sort of generally furtive and unseemly nature of distributing money on rainy street corners outside the OEOB? Answer, I would say that might be an appropriate statement. Question, was there any specific discussion of the Boland Amendment or whether or not you were violating the Boland Amendment? Answer, it was very questionable. I think everyone knew we were walking a very fine line. Question, but nevertheless you joked that you might have gone over the line and might end up in jail. Answer, yes. Do you recall giving those answers to those questions?
Sir, if it's in my deposition, I obviously did.
Mr. Owen, did you have occasion to talk to Colonel North on November 24th or November 25th, 1986?
Yes, sir. I was in the old executive office building on that Monday. I believe it was the 24th. I was seeing someone else. I stopped by Colonel North's office to say hello, and I was with someone else, and we talked for a few minutes.
And did he tell you anything about the situation that had developed?
He said that he was going to resign, that I believe he may have said once again that he was going to be the fall guy. He did say that all he hoped that would come out of it would be that he'd be able to continue to serve his country in the Marine Corps, and that I guess that would be it.
And is it fair to say that during the course of the 2+ years that you worked with Colonel North, you became a friend of his?
Sir, I'm proud to be a friend of Colonel North's.
And testifying about him here today is somewhat difficult for you, is that correct?
Yes, it is. I think Colonel North's been treated unfairly in many ways.
Nevertheless, you have testified as accurately as you can about the facts and the things that he did in furtherance of this operation. Is that fair?
Yes, sir. I've been under oath, and I said in my opening statement that I wanted to tell everything that I knew. I wanted to tell both all of you here and the American public. And I believe in the end, and it's just my belief as a person, that Colonel North will end up being a hero, not a villain as many perceive him to be.
Mr. Chairman, I have no more questions for Mr. Owen.
Thank you very much. The hearing will stand in recess for 5 minutes. The hearing will please come to order. Mr. Leon, please proceed with the inquiry.
Mr. Owen, I'd like to start off my question by going back to a portion of your testimony with Mr. Eggleston, where you were relaying having discussions with Colonel North. And I believe the discussion was put in the terms of almost jokingly discussing about the possibility of either you or him going to jail. And there are a few things I wanted to ask you about those discussions, if I could. First of all, you did say jokingly, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And by jokingly, were you implying that perhaps that was an effort to relieve some of the tension or stress you felt you were both under?
I don't know about Colonel North, but I felt under a lot of pressure and tension at different times.
Would you say Colonel North was working long hours?
I don't think there are very few people in this government who work as long hours as Colonel North did.
And you'd been certainly working long hours, hadn't you?
I guess it's all relative.
Now, at the time you were having those discussions, had Colonel North already given you any indication that he thought of himself as a future fall guy, so to speak?
Yes, as I said, probably on a half dozen times or more, he brought that up.
And had he also given you an indication that he was trying to stay within the law and he wanted you to stay within the law?
Yes, and he always, whether I was moving money or other things, wanted me to be sure to stay within the law. He felt very strongly about that.
Hadn't he indicated to you that he had sought legal advice himself with regard to the law in some of these matters?
At different times that came up. I think that he had, yes.
And wasn't it your impression that he was trying to abide by that legal advice?
I think so. I know that he had seen some of the legal advice that that General Secord had provided and gotten from lawyers, and so I think that he had.
Now, did you ever consciously attempt to violate or disregard any law at any time?
I'm not a lawyer, but no, I didn't consciously try and violate any United States law.
Did you ever disregard a legal limitation that had been placed upon you or in advice by a lawyer?
Not that I can think of.
Do you have any knowledge or reason to believe that Colonel North consciously disregarded a legal limitation placed upon him by anybody?
Again, I'm not a lawyer, but no, I don't think that he did.
Just asking you what your impression was at that time.
I think Colonel North did what he did because he felt he was doing it, he was doing what the President wanted. I don't have any direct knowledge, as I said, or indirect knowledge necessarily what the President knew, but I think also that there were others in the administration who knew what Colonel North was doing.
Did he allude to the President giving him instructions along those lines?
No, he never alluded to the President giving him actual instructions.
You've also testified about moving sums of money
Yes.
in the form of cash and traveler's checks. Now, what was your impression as to why you were doing it in the form of cash or traveler's checks?
I once asked Colonel North why we were using traveler's checks, and he said, well, it's very easy. There are no receipts left. Well, when I was in a deposition and someone showed me a packet of traveler's checks or copies of traveler's checks, I guess Murphy's Law came into effect again.
He obviously kept a log of these traveler's checks. You've testified to that.
He did.
Was there any reason besides secrecy to use cash? Convenience, perhaps.
Sure. I mean, you're not going to open up a banking account in the name of the Nicaraguan Democratic Resistance, and it was the easiest form of capital to use.
Do you have any reason to believe that either Mr. McFarland or Mr. Poindexter had knowledge of Oliver North keeping traveler's checks in his safe in his office?
I have no knowledge of that.
Do you have any reason to believe they did?
I have no reason to believe that they did or they didn't.
Now, with respect to yourself, did you at any time seek to obtain any personal profit from the monies that you were handling on behalf of Colonel North?
No, sir, I did not.
And you did not take any money for your own personal profit from these?
No, sir. On one occasion, on October 19th, 1985, which was the day that I got married, and Colonel North came to my wedding. Matter of fact, I think he had just flown in from Honduras, and he got into his car and drove down, so I obviously was much appreciative of that. He did provide me $1,000 in traveler's checks, and I said, I don't feel comfortable taking this, but he said, no, please, use it as you see fit. He also knew that at that time, I believe, again, it was late October, or it was October 19th, that I had not received, to the best of my knowledge, I had not received my, I guess you would say, my stipend or my funds for October, and probably, I think, for September at the time, because on several occasions, Mr. Calero has said that they were just short of money, and also he and I weren't as in contact as often as we had been, so he did give me the $1,000. I think throughout this process, I'm out of a job right now. I left a pretty well-paying job with Grain Company, and I didn't look to get into this for money, or my only motive was for doing what was right for the country and what I thought was right for those who were fighting in the jungles of Nicaragua. And just going back to that $1,000, and Colonel North did say that we want you to have it. He didn't necessarily say who, but I had invited Adolfo Calero to my wedding, and I don't know, maybe Adolfo Calero thought that would be a nice wedding present for me.
Were you aware of any evidence to indicate that Colonel North pocketed any profits from the monies that were being handled by him?
I'm not aware of any evidence, and I believe that Colonel North is an honest man, and I don't think he would use any funds for his own personal gain.
With respect to the Boland Amendment, you testified that there were discussions, concerns, I should say, on your part and Colonel North's part when you were making joking references to being incarcerated. Have you studied the Boland Amendment?
Sir, I've read it, but I can't say I necessarily studied it, but I certainly read it.
You never sought a legal opinion, did you, as to its applicability to either you or Colonel North?
No, at sometime in the fall of '85 or sometime in '86, I knew that, or I learned that the President's Intelligence Oversight Board had, I believe, provided a memo to the effect that the Boland Amendment did not affect the National Security Council.
Do you know who wrote that opinion?
Yes, his name is Brett Cerrone, who's the counsel.
Did you ever read that?
No, sir, I did not.
Did Colonel North make reference to it in your presence?
I can't really remember. I know that on one occasion that I was told about it.
Are you aware if the Boland Amendment has any criminal sanctions that are attached to it?
No, sir.
So when you're joking about criminal violations, as was pointed out in reference to a deposition, you didn't see that deposition before today, did you?
No, sir, I did not. I haven't reread my testimony.
You haven't had a chance to review it.
No, and I haven't reviewed it either.
Well, with respect to that deposition, with regard to your references to joking about possible criminal violations, would those have been criminal violations attached to Boland, if there are no criminal violations attached to it?
No, sir.
Now, with respect to the legal authority of your conduct, Exhibit 17, RWO 17, is a copy of the contract, is it not, between IDEA, a company that you put together, and NHAO, the Nicaraguan Humanitarian Assistance Operation?
Yes, it is.
And you've had a chance to review that, haven't you?
Yes, sir.
And you're specifically familiar with that clause, clause number 4, in Section 4, that provides certain prohibitions and limitations, are you not?
Yes.
Now, who drafted this contract, Mr. Owen?
State Department.
And you reviewed it before you signed it?
Yes, sir, I did.
And did you have legal counsel review it as well?
I believe I had a fellow who was at that time acting as counsel to IDEA look at it.
Okay. And you were aware of that clause before you signed it, did you not?
Yes, sir, I was.
And was it your understanding of that clause that you were not a employee of the State Department on a full-time basis, that is, 24 hours a day?
That's right. I mean, in fact, there was always some question as to who I did work for, whether I worked for UNO, the United Nicaraguan Opposition, or I worked for the State Department. I was, on one occasion, had conversations with the representative of the General Accounting Office, and he put that question to me, and I said I was asked, excuse me, I should say IDEA, which is a corporation, not me as an individual, was asked by UNO to undertake this effort, and I subsequently was brought on by IDEA and by the Nicaraguan Humanitarian Assistance Office, and I think that something that I could have said earlier and I didn't, but I'd like to say is that everyone knew, I think in the State Department, or at least those who had knowledge of it, that I, if not was Ally North's man, at least had a good rapport with them.
Was Mr. Doomling's deputy, Mr. Arcos, aware of that to your knowledge?
He knew that Ally and I were friends, yes.
And so is it your testimony that in March, when you went down on that L-100 flight, that when you were through unloading that flight, you were no longer, after that was done, you were no longer working under this contract for the State Department?
I believe Colonel North and I talked about it, and my reaction at the time was my work for NHAO as far as overseeing the flight down and the unloading and talking with the doctors and those who were receiving it was such that at that time my commitment to NHAO was completed, and I was a private citizen, and I'm not sure that some people would argue, but I would have to say that a private citizen on his own time can do what it is that they want. And I would also add that, again, I was receiving orders from, not orders, well, I guess you could say orders. I was being requested by a member of the National Security Council.
Well, I'll go back to that point in a second, but let me just ask you this. You've just testified that you expressed concern to Colonel North before you engaged in that March mission, which fell through ultimately.
Right.
But you expressed concern that it might be violative of your contract, not violative of the law.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. And
Because you didn't believe Boland applied to you.
that's right.
Okay.
And, you know, obviously I didn't believe that it necessarily applied to Colonel North either.
Okay. Now, you're expressing concern that it might be violative of your contract. You're bringing this to the attention of Colonel North, and what's his reaction?
I said, look, you're doing this for me. I'm a member of the President's staff, of the National Security staff, and you're doing it on your own time.
Did he ever say to you, I'll go get a legal opinion from someone here to make sure that you're on firm ground?
No, he did not say that.
Were you disappointed he didn't ask for a legal opinion from anyone at the White House before he dispatched you to go ahead on that mission?
As what he was doing was in a covert capacity, I'm not sure that he would feel comfortable going and asking for a legal opinion on that.
And he certainly didn't ask Ambassador Doomling if it would be all right with him if you went ahead and did that, did he?
No, he didn't, neither did I.
Now, let's get back to that point you were just making there about Ollie saying he was a member of the National Security Council and the staff of the President. You've testified you've never met Robert McFarlane, is that correct?
That's right, I have not.
And you've never met Admiral Poindexter?
I have not.
And you did testify, I believe, that Ollie on at least one occasion said to you that he was sending his memos across the street, which you implied to mean to the NSC director at that time.
Yes.
Do you recall who was the director at the time he made that statement?
I think it was Bud McFarlane.
Did you ever receive any indication that McFarlane had in fact reviewed those memoranda?
No, sir, I don't. I did not.
And did you ever demand any assurance from Ollie North that such approval had been sought and obtained from his superiors?
No, I did not. When I walk into the old executive office building, which is right next door to the White House, and I talk with a man who is associated with it and is a U.S. government representative who works, I knew, very closely with the national security advisors, I believe that that was good enough for me. I wasn't about to go try and track down a legal opinion.
So did you take the notion that he was acting under the authority of his supervisors, so to speak, on blind faith?
Yes, sir, I did. I also was in his office on a number of occasions when he would have conversations over the phone with different people, and that gave me cause to think that obviously that they had some idea what he was doing too.
Did it ever cross your mind, Mr. Owen, that perhaps Colonel North was acting out on his own, on a limb?
It never did.
Okay. Did it ever occur to you that if the public found out what it was that Colonel North was doing in Central America, and in specific what he was having you do while you were working for NOHO, that the Contra program would be jeopardized in the long run?
I'm not sure that I would say the American public. I would say the Congress.
All right. Well, with regard to the Congress, I believe you testified just a little while ago about a congressional resolution of inquiry, correct? And I believe you testified that Colonel North told you that he had indicated to Congress simply that he only knew you and had only met with you on a few occasions. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Certainly, when he told you that, you must have realized that he was taking a very large risk with regard to his testimony to with regard to his testimony to Congress about you.
I did, but this was also in August 1986, and I was by that time several months out of the program.
Well, did you regard his statements of that nature regarding his relationship with you under oath to be a rather risky venture on his part?
Obviously, I guess I did.
Did you have any reason to believe that he had the authority of Admiral Poindexter when he took those risks?
No, I did not. But I just would like to interject something here, in that on the day that he resigned or was fired, I'm not sure which it was, I did track him down and had a phone conversation with him, and I just wanted to express my concern and my support, and he said, well, you know, I would never do anything unless I had orders or other people knew what I was doing. And I said, yes, I do know that, and I believe that.
Let me ask you this. In light of the risks that you've acknowledged he being engaged in and yourself being engaged in terms of it becoming public, in light of the risks that Colonel North obviously took in making those statements as he did to Congress during the resolution of inquiry with regard to you, in retrospect now, do you think those risks were worth running with respect to the long-range interests of the Contra program?
I think it was a very difficult time for all of us. Those who were committed to this endeavor felt at the time that we had to do whatever we could to make it succeed and to help it succeed. I believe Colonel North was working under the assumption that he was doing, if not the direct orders, that he was doing what the President wanted him to do. I think in hindsight, much of this program, ever since the beginning and its inception, has probably been done, well, obviously not as well as it could have been undertaken. So I think we all have regrets.
Or was it a worth risk running?
I guess I would have to answer that on a human value, and that is that if it saved lives and if it helped further the cause and further freedom, that it probably was worth it.
No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes Senator Boren.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Owen, I hope you understand that in these hearings we're trying to be constructive. Hopefully the process that we're going through will teach us some lessons about how to conduct ourselves in the future.
Yes, sir.
So that we can build back together what I hope will be not a Republican or a Democratic foreign policy, but an American foreign policy.
Senator, may I just say that I fully agree with you on that?
And I want to ask you some questions in that spirit, and I feel a responsibility to put some questions to you. As I've listened to you, the words that I've written down on my legal pad again and again have been about a confusion of ends and means. I obviously don't quarrel with your ends. As you probably know, I voted again and again for aid to the Contras. I feel very strongly about what the current regime is doing to stifle freedom of the press, free exercise of religion in Nicaragua, and I can understand your strong personal commitment to try to do something to avoid the establishment of another communist base in our own hemisphere and to provide greater freedom for the people of that country. And I sympathize with the goal that you were working for very much. Obviously, there's nothing illegal in being for aid to the Contras. Several of us on this committee have voted for it. But in all honesty, what I'm concerned about is the ends to that, or the means to that end. And you've been a teacher. I've been a teacher of government. There are a lot of students undoubtedly watching this hearing this morning. And I wonder, upon reflection, how you feel about the means, in this case, that were adopted, perhaps with good intention, to try to accomplish what you and I believe was a worthy end. Would you want those students that you've taught in the past to readily adopt some of the means that you have admitted to us in these hearings that you've adopted?
I go back to what Thomas Paine said. I think it was, these are the times that try men's souls. There was, I think, we all had the best intentions. I think one of the things that is coming out of this hearing, that I'm just a civilian, a private citizen, that is going to end up being the focus of it, and that is who has the ultimate responsibility for deciding on foreign policy. I agree with you that we need to have a foreign policy which is bipartisan and which people agree on. And I think that the President of the United States had very clearly set out what his foreign policy was.
Let me ask you, let's be very open and honest at this point, and because I think there's some lessons here that's important for all of us to learn. I wouldn't imagine that a person who's idealistic as you are, and I accept the sincerity of your idealism, I respect that, would not feel too good about having to come before us and claim his privilege against self-incrimination and be given immunity under the legal process in order to testify. I wouldn't think that that would be something that you would mark down as something that you really feel very good about.
It's not a high point in my life, no.
No. Well, you mentioned the Minority Council used the term taking risks. Let's perhaps use some old-fashioned terms again, and I ask you this not to be unkind, but I think it's important for us to draw these out. When you learned that Colonel North was testifying before Congress and all he told the Congressional Committee was that he knew you, he didn't report about the nature of your relationship, that you had carried intelligence back and forth, or that you had taken funds back and forth, or that you had been involved in a process to continue aid to the Contras during the time of the congressional ban, did you approve of Colonel North not being more forthcoming or not telling the full truth to the Congressional Committee?
I guess deep within my soul I had some question about that, but I think also that he felt, and obviously from the profs that have now been brought out through the Tower Commission, others besides him felt that it was appropriate as to what his actions were and what his comments were.
If you had been before that committee, would you have hoped that you might have, at that point, told the entire truth and laid it out to them?
Sir, that would have been a very difficult decision, and not being in that position, I'm not sure how I'd respond to that.
What about the contract? Now, we've had the contract referred to under which you worked with Ambassador Dumling, and this contract says, and I quote Section 4 of it, Mr. Robert Owen shall not during the term of this grant perform any service which is related to the acquisition, transportation, repair, storage, or use of weapons, weapon systems, ammunition, or other equipment, vehicles, or material. And yet, throughout your testimony and your questioning by staff, you've indicated that indeed you did talk about arrangements, about unloading weapons onto flights that first brought humanitarian cargo. How do you feel about not living up to your contractual obligation as a means? When you're talking to your students, would that be something that you would say that you approved of as a means to an end?
In response to that, I can only go back to what I told the Minority Council, and I believe Mr. Eggleston. At the time, I felt that I had and was in my right to take off my hat working for NHAO and put on my hat as Robert Owen, private citizen. Some obviously would question that, and you obviously do, sir, and I respect you for that.
Well, it just says that you won't perform any service during the term of your employment. What about Mr. Dumling? Did you ever tell Mr. Dumling that you were asked by Colonel North to go over there and be his eyes and ears? Did you expressly tell him that?
Sir, when I first met with Ambassador Dumling, I think he was very wary of me, and I probably was very wary of him. I know that he probably received a phone call from Colonel North saying, "Why don't you talk to this young man?" But no, I did not go and tell him that.
Did you ever tell him that you were involved, in fact, in the operation of on the side, as you put it, while working for him, that you were involved in arranging shipments of arms, drawing up wish lists of arms and munitions? Did you ever tell Ambassador Dumling that?
Well, if I can clarify that a little bit. No, I did not.
You did not. Should you have told him that if you were being, here's an employer who is also asked you to sign a contract or enter into a contract that you wouldn't engage in these activities while working for this office. Again, I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm not trying to press you. As I told you in the beginning, I admire the goal toward which you were working. But obviously, as one who supports the Contras, I'm concerned that what we've done here in terms of the means that have been adopted may end up damaging that cause very much. And I'm trying to see if in reflection, you're not concerned about means as well as about ends.
Sir, I think we're always concerned about means and ends. But also, I think that, in my mind, that if those arms could save some lives, and they also would take lives, I realize that.
But are you proud about the fact that you didn't tell Mr. Dumling that you were doing this on the side when you knew, because he wrote it into the contract, that he was very concerned about that, as the very least as a conflict of interest?
Senator, quite frankly, he never asked and I never volunteered.
Have you ever worried about it since then, that you didn't tell Mr. Dumling that you really didn't shoot straight with Mr. Dumling? Let's just really lay it out. You didn't, did you?
Sir, I didn't look at it as not shooting straight.
Well, what about carrying intelligence information to the Contras? Now, this was during a period of time in which, obviously, it was against the law for the government to supply intelligence information. This was during the period of the total ban, and you, as you say, were acting as a private citizen at that time. Did you feel good about being a courier to deliver something that was clearly illegal at the time? Whether or not you and I think it should have been illegal, I voted that it shouldn't be. I voted to provide that help, but I was outvoted, and it was illegal at that period of time. How do you feel about being a courier to take information that could not be legally provided? Is that an appropriate means?
Sir, I once asked Colonel North about that, and he said the material had been declassified. I guess you'd have to check on that.
How would you feel if someone that supported the Sandinista government, which you and I both disapprove very strongly, supported their cause, had been supplying intelligence information to the Sandinistas as you were supplying it to the Contras during that time?
Sir, I have no doubt that there are people who support the Sandinistas that do provide them with intelligence.
Well, do you approve of that?
No, sir, I don't. But also I would suggest that these hearings are looking at those that support the Contras. I think
Well,
probably hearings could be held
No,
for those that
in all
support the
due respect,
Sandinistas.
I think, in all due respect, it's not a debate about the Contras, because I've told you where I stand on that. It's a debate about the law. Now, would belief in their cause, just because they strongly believed in providing help to the Sandinistas, would that have made it lawful for them to have supplied intelligence to the Sandinista government if they believed every bit as strongly and as sincerely as you do that that would be the right thing to do?
I guess we all have choices, and they would have made theirs. And no, I don't think it was legal, but then if you also heard what I said, my understanding was the material had been declassified.
Well, again, I just go back to it. And I would urge you again, as a former teacher, to do some real thinking about that, because if we embark on a course in this country where everyone can do what they think is right without regard to the law, as strongly as we may feel about a particular course of policy, it's a dangerous course. There were 2 people indicted in my home state about 10 days ago for trying to raise private funds and to plot to assassinate the leader of the current Nicaraguan government. I don't particularly admire the leader of the current Nicaraguan government at all. In fact, I feel strongly about what he's doing. But what's it going to do to this country if everyone who has a strong belief about something decides they can do whatever they want to do without abiding by the law?
So I have to agree with you. I think those people were probably idiots, but there have been a cast of thousands that have been idiots involved in this. But quite frankly, you're assuming that everything that was done is and was illegal, and I don't think that's been proven yet. This isn't a court of law. I beg to differ with you on that point.
Let me take you to the question of CIA involvement. Your testimony raises some questions about whether CIA personnel assisted the Contras in ways prohibited by the law. When you delivered maps and photos from Colonel North to various Contra leaders in November 1984 and February and April of 1985, did you have any indication that CIA personnel knew that Colonel North was going to use CIA-prepared materials for that purpose?
Sir, I was in his office on several occasions, when he made phone calls to what I believe was the CIA.
Did you ever meet or talk directly to the CIA task force chief about such materials?
No, sir, I did not.
Were you ever told, or was there ever any indication given to you by Colonel North or anyone else that the CIA task force chief might have been providing such materials?
If you remember my testimony on Thursday about the maps that were on the large
Yes.
pegboards, I believe I was in Colonel North's office when he picked up the phone and at one point called and talked with the director of the task force. Yes, sir.
So you had the impression from that conversation that the director of the task force at the CIA at least knew about these maps, that they were there?
I can't testify to that, but I guess I would have to assume it.
But you do not know with certainty whether or not they were provided. The task force chief testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee in December 1986 that he turned down requests from North during this period to prepare intelligence for deliveries to the Contras. Would you contradict that testimony or be in a position to contradict it?
Sir, I can't contradict it. I can only tell you what I carried.
So you do not know the source?
Sir, I told you it was from across the river. I know that one of the sets of maps was provided by a CIA courier.
And there was at least one telephone conversation with the task force chief and Colonel North while you were in his office?
I believe so, yes, sir.
What about the delivery of a secure communications device known as a KL-43 by you to senior CIA official in Costa Rica? Did you know what use he made of that device?
I know he was going to use it to keep in secure communications with Colonel North and with others.
Did the CIA officer in Costa Rica, who's known as Thomas Castillo, did he visit a planned site of an airstrip with you?
Yes, sir, he did. We flew out on a Costa Rica government helicopter.
Did he advise you about taking photographs of that site?
Matter of fact, I think I may have used his camera. I can't remember.
Did he help you develop the cover story about the fact that the airstrip would be used for an agricultural experiment station?
We were talking with the Costa Rican officials as well as him, and I think that came up as probably the most logical that could be used.
Did CIA personnel ever assist you in getting military supplies moved from a warehouse at Palmarola to Aguacate in Honduras?
They did not assist me. I knew that there was military hardware over in Palmarola that had come in from, I believe, Portugal. And it was supposed to be moved at one point from Palmarola to Aguacate. Matter of fact, one of the L-100s was supposed to go over there and ferry it over, but at the time there was an NHAO official on it, and so they had to scrub the mission. The Hondurans subsequently got very upset that it wasn't moved when they were told it was going to be moved.
You mentioned in your testimony earlier that you went to the old executive office building on November 24th,
Yes, sir.
1986. With whom did you meet on that date?
I met with Brett Cerrone. I had with me a friend by the name of Bruce Cameron. He had just come back from Guatemala. I believe Mr. Cerrone was going to be going down there at some point, and so I just thought it would be nice to let him tell him about Guatemala and the situation
That was the
there.
date before the termination, the day before the termination of Colonel North.
Yes, sir. It was just coincidence.
Were those the only two people? Was that the only person with whom you met, the
Yes,
OB,
sir.
on that date? Have you had any conversations with Colonel North over the last 2 or 3 months?
I've had several. I called him on that day, as I said, and the next day and talked with him. I subsequently had a conversation with my lawyer and his lawyer. I felt and still feel very close to Colonel North.
When was the conversation with your lawyer and his lawyer?
In December, sometime before Christmas, and then in March, my two lawyers and myself went over and had lunch with his lawyers. I will say right now in front of you that before any conversations took place, both lawyers agreed that the guidelines would be of our conversation, that there would be nothing substantive. We would not talk about the case. It was an opportunity as friends to get together, to see each other. And I had, I believe I called him on Christmas Day and wished him Christmas, and I called him when I learned that my wife was pregnant to let him know.
What's the most recent conversation that you've had with him?
When I called him to let my wife know, or to let him know my wife was pregnant, and that was within the last month, I think.
Any other conversation during that about the pending issues?
No, sir. We both studiously stayed away from that. I will say that I did talk with him and his lawyer at one point. Before I had a lawyer, I picked up the phone and called, and before Ali even got on the phone, his lawyer said, "Look, Rob, I want you to know that Ali wants you and I want you to tell the truth when the time comes, and it will come."
Let me ask you, you wrote a memo in which you expressed concern to Colonel North about drug-related activities getting involved with the operation, or at least some of the people perhaps being somewhat unsavory. I believe you talked about a plane that had been used to run drugs.
Yes, sir.
Talked about some of the crew being a pretty rough-looking bunch. You were fearful that they had criminal records. What was the nature of your concern about involvement of people that might have had ties to drug running?
Sir, that plane was supplied, if I remember correctly, the group that provided that plane had been referred to NHAO by the CIA, and in my mind it was stupidity to use a plane that at one time had been used, or at least targeted as having been used, to carry drugs, and also it was stupidity to use people who had a criminal record.
Were there dissatisfactions expressed by some of the other people involved in the operation, Mr. Calero and others, or reports of skimming or late delivery of equipment by Mr. Secord and his operations from some of the people involved?
I had a conversation with Mr. Calero. I believe it may even have been in the Miami airport, and I'm not sure when it was, when he was concerned about the lateness of equipment that he had purchased, and I think it finally didn't even get to Central America until sometime in 1986, and he had paid for it in 1985.
So he was expressing dissatisfaction with Mr. Secord's handling of that particular aspect of the delivery?
Yes, there were times that he expressed that, yes, sir.
What about you yourself seem to express some concern about Mr. Secord being involved with Mr. Gadd and the requirement to use Mr. Gadd?
Are you referring to a specific memo?
I believe there was a communication along those lines between you and Colonel North. Or maybe it was a conversation with you and Mr. Calero.
I had a conversation with Mario Calero, Adolfo Calero's brother, and as a matter of fact, Colonel North had talked to me and asked me to contact Mario Calero and tell him that someone would be in touch with him. At that time, Mr. Gadd was using the name Mr. East, and that I just asked Mario to listen to him and told him that it was felt that this person would probably be able to do the best job as far as contracting for the movement of NHAO goods.
Talk about Mr. Gadd.
Yes, I'm talking about Mr. Gadd. And Mario at one time made a suggestion to me that he and Adolfo, his brother, were both, they were not happy with Mr. Gadd's performance.
Let me ask one last question. My time has just about expired. March 17th, 1987, you sent a memo to North discussing, I believe that's 86, the false receipts and unanswered questions about where NHAO money was going. Then there was a report in the Miami Herald, and let me say I read this without any expression of whether or not it's true, but simply decided on the record to ask you about it.
I know the report you're referring to.
The report, February 16th, Miami Herald article talks about some false receipts, and it says a clerk at a store in San Jose, clothing store, identified a photograph of 6'4" Owen as the unusually tall, fair-skinned gringo, in quotes, who in January 1986 came into her discount outlet with two other men to get the bogus receipt. What is that all about? Were you ever involved in terms of, on instruction of Colonel North or anyone else, in terms of preparing bogus receipts or picking up bogus receipts? What did you mean about bogus receipts in this memo that you're writing?
I certainly am aware of the Miami Herald article, and I'm aware of the investigation that's going on regarding false receipts. To the best of my knowledge, Senator, I did not attend or go to a store with any other people to pick up false receipts. In the beginning, when NHAO started, it was originally said that pro forma receipts would be acceptable, meaning these people did not have the funds or the credit anywhere where they could go and buy something and then say, well, we'll take them off your hands and we'll pay you in a couple months or a couple weeks. Who's going to give credit to a bunch of Indians and blacks down in Costa Rica who don't have two nickels to rub together? So the feeling was in the beginning that pro forma receipts would be allowed. I think subsequently there was a ruling that they would not be allowed. In this case, I think they probably went ahead, provided a pro forma receipt for this material. There are also allegations that...
Did you know that they did?
Yes, sir, I was aware that they did provide pro forma receipts.
Did you express concern in that memo? You expressed concern about false receipts. What was the nature of that concern that you were expressing?
Sir, I guess if you'd like...
Why were you concerned?
Sure. I guess if you'd like my overview of how NHAO is run, I'd be happy to do that. I'm a taxpayer. I care about how U.S. money is spent. I don't want to see it wasted. I think the way the system that was set up to funnel the funds to the Nicaraguan resistance through NHAO was probably the worst possible system that could have been arrived at. I realize there are numerous constraints. If I can just finish, in the very beginning, back in November, I sent a memo both to Ambassador Dumling, and I talked with Colonel North about it. It was my belief that, in essence, you should have bean counters in the countries in question so that they can provide oversight to the goods that are purchased, because there may just possibly be false receipts that are provided, or pro forma receipts that are provided, and then the funds may be diverted somewhere. In one case, one of the people from the group in Costa Rica wrote a letter to Ambassador Dumling and said that $15,000 had been diverted for the use of arms. I was not aware that the money had been diverted for the use of arms. I was working closely with those people. I think that some of them felt it was in my best interest and their best interest that they not tell me about that.
But you did tell him that you're personally aware of receipts being prepared after the fact.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to recognize the Majority Leader of the House, Congressman Foley.
Mr. Owen, you've testified several times about your deep commitment to the Contra cause. When did you first become interested in supporting the Contras?
When I was a Senate staffer for Senator Quayle I started with him, I believe, in 1982. One of my positions that I worked into was as you would call the foreign relations legislative assistant, if you will. At that time, one of my major areas of concentration was in Southeast Asia, but also Central America was getting hot, and he was concerned about that. And then in the summer of 1983, as I testified on Thursday, an Indiana constituent came in with a Nicaraguan who had just come out of the jungles. And
John Hull.
Yes, sir, John Hull.
And then you've testified that you went to work for Gray and Company, and there was a possibility of a contract with the Contras,
Yes, sir.
but that finally Gray and Company decided this would not be appropriate, and
Yes,
you
sir.
accepted an offer on a trip to Central America to work for Adolfo Calero
That's correct.
at a salary of about $2,400 a month.
2,500, sir.
25. Was that more or less than you were being paid by Gray and Company? About the same?
It was about the same, maybe it had been a little bit less, but out of that also were going to come some of my expenses.
And shortly after that, you became involved in carrying maps and messages and money for Colonel North.
Yes, sir.
Did Colonel North know, I assume he did, of your arrangement with Mr. Calero?
Yes, I assume that he did. I mean, I think that probably
You
before...
ever discuss it with him?
I think probably before Adolfo decided that I could be of help to him, that he may have had a conversation with Colonel North, and Colonel North probably
Did you
said-
assume that this was probably a result of a discussion between Colonel North and Mr. Calero?
I thought that they must have had a conversation about it. And if I can just backtrack for a minute, I didn't really answer your question clearly regarding when I first became committed or concerned about the Central American issue. Are you interested in hearing that, or would you rather go on with your
Well, I
question?
just wanted to establish the time frame. I think
Okay.
your commitment is well established, and we
Okay.
accept it's a sincere commitment. What I'm interested in is your relationship with Colonel North. You've just said that you assumed that Colonel North and Mr. Calero may have discussed your employment by Mr. Calero prior to it. You were actually being employed.
Yes, sir.
So you assumed that everything that you did for Colonel North was consistent with your employment by Mr. Calero?
Yes, sir.
Did you report to Mr. Calero what you were doing for Colonel North?
Sir, when I was moving maps or other such things, I usually gave them to Mr. Calero so he knew where they were coming from.
But you didn't feel it particularly necessary to tell him everything that you discussed with Colonel North or what you were doing for Colonel North? Is that fair?
By and large, he knew what I was doing. I provided him with occasionally some written memos about what my observations were and what I was doing. Yes, sir.
Essentially, your directions all during this time from 1984 through 1986 were coming from Colonel North. Isn't that correct?
I think you can probably assume that, although I did things for Adolfo Calero too, but
Did you
Probably
report
more
the
for-
things you did for Mr. Calero to Colonel North?
yes, sir.
So it was Colonel North that was getting the reports and Colonel North that was giving the instructions.
By and large, yes, sir.
You may have had a slip of the tongue, but you just, in your testimony in response to Mr. Leon, talked about taking orders from Colonel North.
I guess you can call them orders, requests, whatever you want to call them, sir.
You had no doubt that you were acting at the direction of Colonel North, did you? I mean, that was your state of mind and your attitude?
Certainly on the things when he asked me to do, such as carry intelligence or other such things, obviously, sir.
Did you ever refuse a request by Colonel North?
Not that I can remember, no, sir.
Did you ever fail to carry out a request or order of Colonel North?
No, sir.
Did you keep Colonel North advised at all times of all the experiences and activities you had, the most important ones with respect to your activity in Central America with those who were associated with the Contra cause?
Sir, one of the things that I ended up becoming, I guess it was through default, was keeping Colonel North informed about a number of different things. Some would say I was his eyes and ears. He was obviously getting tremendous intelligence, amounts of intelligence from CIA and other government intelligence agencies. One of my concerns was the involvement of some Americans and the detriment that that would bring to the cause, and so I kept them informed about that as well.
You were actually quite pleased and proud to be the eyes and ears of Colonel North, were you not?
Sir, I think if you talk with any of my friends, that they will tell you that I never told them what it was that I was doing. Matter of fact, most of the time, people would say, well, do you know Colonel North? And I would say, well, I've met him. So I tried to keep that very confidential.
So you, in fact, were involved in a confidential and secret relationship with Colonel North?
It wasn't something that I bragged about, nor do I think it was something that he necessarily discussed.
But you didn't tell your friends what you were doing.
No, sir, I did not.
And you took pains to keep your relationship with Colonel North secret, did you not?
Yes, sir. I didn't feel it was appropriate.
Even to the point of not meeting with Colonel North sometimes in the executive office building for fear that that would attract attention.
That's correct.
That's in relationship to the computer that keeps track of appointments, isn't that right?
That's correct, sir.
And in fact, all during this time, you were living the life of a secret agent, were you not?
I wouldn't necessarily call it that, no. I led a very open life.
Were operating openly with respect to laundering money?
I'm not sure whether I was laundering money. I was cashing traveler's checks.
Is that the normal way you transact business, to cash traveler's checks and give money to people?
No, sir, it's not.
If you were handing money and traveler's checks at night and secret to people through open windows of cars, and if you were cashing traveler's checks secretly, not by open bank accounts, and if you were hiding your identity of your employer and your supervisor, those who gave you directions, in a private business, would you consider that highly irregular?
Sir, I was working in a very confidential area. There was a need-to-know basis. It was something that had...
In other words, secret.
Sure. Had the press come to know about it, I didn't want to risk my life any more than I had to.
In other words, secret. Is that fair?
Yes, sir. It's fair.
And you were the agent of Colonel North, were you not?
You could call me that.
So is it fair to say you were the secret agent of Colonel North?
I won't quibble with you, Congressman.
All right. I'm not trying to trap you. I'm just trying to find out, because you're an extremely honest and forthcoming witness. I think we all have that impression. But we're interested in the state of mind of what you thought your responsibilities were and who you were working for.
Sure.
When you worked for the NOAA, as it's sometimes called.
No way, yes. It's been referred to as that.
You didn't tell him, you've testified, you didn't tell Ambassador Demling of your activities.
I did not I did not tell Ambassador Demling, but I think he knew well of where I came and who I reported to.
So you assumed that Ambassador Demling and the State Department actually knew that you had another covert side and that you were dealing with these matters in violation of the law as far as the, at least the intention of humanitarian aid was concerned?
Well, I guess that's questionable, but as far as Ambassador Demling's knowledge of my contacts with Colonel North, we never really discussed it, but, excuse me, I think he was well aware of them.
Well, again, I'm trying to find out what you thought about your superior's attitude. You knew that it was not permissible under the law for humanitarian aid to be given for lethal purposes.
Right, and that's something that I think everyone tried to walk a very fine line to ensure that it was not used for lethal purposes. I just want to make one point, in that at times I was in somewhat of an awkward position, because I would sometimes know what Ambassador Demling was going to ask me to do before he would ask me, just because Colonel North would alert me to that fact.
So you had a sort of irregular relationship with your ostensible employer and supervisor, Ambassador Demling. You really actually had been told ahead of time what your instructions would be from him?
This was just one occasion. It was regarding moving what were called butler buildings.
Did you regard this really as kind of a cover job?
As a what?
Cover job?
No, sir, because I tried to walk a very fine line. I did my best to help the groups that I was asked to work with, which were the Indians and the blacks, and those in the South. These were people who had little to next to nothing. Also, I worked very closely with the humanitarian medical program and Dr. Tomas, who was head of the medical program.
But actually your main commitment was to the Contra cause in all its respects, not just to the humanitarian aid side, wasn't it?
I would say that, but the majority of my time, matter of fact, probably 90 to 99% of my time was spent working with NHAO and fulfilling those responsibilities.
If it came down to taking requests or orders from Colonel North or Ambassador Demling, which would you have considered your real director or supervisor?
I was never really asked to choose, so I guess I was fortunate in that regard.
You think you would have had a conflict about it?
I don't know. We were all working for the same thing. Obviously, that there was Ambassador Dumling didn't know all that Colonel North was doing.
Isn't it fair to say that all during this time you looked to Colonel North as your principal in terms of helping the Contra cause?
But when I moved to NHAO, I would say that my contact with Colonel North was severely curtailed just because he didn't have time and I didn't have time. We were both doing things. When I would come back from Central America, I would certainly write a memo and keep him up to date with what was going on, but I didn't look to him as my supervisor, no.
If he requested, you said you've never refused to do anything that he requested you to do. Did he ever give you any requests while you were employed by Ambassador Demling?
I already responded to that, and that was yes, specifically.
And you carried them out?
Specifically for that flight, yes, sir.
If you said that he didn't ask you, are you satisfied you would have told Ambassador Dumling of your relationships with Colonel North if he had asked you?
I certainly would have admitted that I had contacts with him, yes.
Would you have told him the whole story?
Are you asking specifically about the flight?
About your relationship. Suppose he asked you about your relationship with Colonel North and what you were doing, what you had done for him, what your current activities were. Would you have told Ambassador Demling all those things?
I think I would have told him. I may not have talked to him about keeping Colonel North informed about the necessity for arms.
You would have kept that secret?
I think so, yes, because I didn't want to compromise Ambassador Dumling. He was in a very difficult position as it was, and I would rather have the blame fall on me than on Ambassador Dumling.
But you would also be concerned about breaching the security of your relationship, would you not, with Colonel North and with the...
Sir, at this point, when I went to work for him, I don't think there was any way that that could be breached. He already knew of my association with Colonel North.
You knew all of it?
I'm not sure that he knew the intimate details, but he had a good idea.
Would you have told him the intimate details?
No, sir, I would not.
All right. So even during this period, you were carrying on a covert, furtive relationship with your ostensible employer while carrying on what you thought was serving the Contra cause?
I occasionally did things that were not under the guise of NHO, yes, sir.
You were willing to take some financial expense in these efforts, were you not? You've testified to that.
Yes, sir.
And you would be willing to take some physical risk, wouldn't you?
Sir, there were occasions when I guess I thought my life might have been in danger.
And you were willing to assume that?
Sir, when you have a cause you're willing to believe
Right.
in, you're willing to die for it.
So you're willing to take physical risks. Would you be willing to take risks to your future career in order to advance it?
Sir, if I can just relate sort of a quick synopsis that I think will help you understand where I come from. I had occasion to come to know General John P. Flynn, who's United States Air Force retired general. He spent 6.5 years in the Hanoi Hilton, and as he said, he got a PhD in communism. He once shared with me his hierarchy of values, and they were above all, integrity comes first. And when you talk about integrity, you ask yourself, is what I'm doing right or is it wrong? And if it's really right, then I must do everything in my power to help, and if it's really wrong, then I must oppose it with all of my might.
And you thought that supporting the Contra cause was right?
Yes, sir, and I was willing to risk my life, my fortunes, and also advancement in my career, obviously. I mean, I don't even know where I'm going to get my next job.
I think that's fair, and I think we understand that. You're also willing to take some risks that you might be violating the law as well, weren't you?
I guess if I was really overly concerned, I would have gone to see a lawyer, but I knew I may have been walking a fine line.
You thought you were walking finally, willing to take that risk in part because you believed in the cause you were supporting?
Sir, if out of all this, I mean, I've been granted immunity by this committee. I've not been granted immunity by the special counsel. I understand that there's a grand jury investigating me down in Miami. If I am to go into jail, I guess that was a chance that I took.
So, in effect, yes, you were willing to take some risks.
Yes, sir.
And you did that because you thought, as you testified a little bit ago, that we had to do everything we could to advance the cause.
Sir, I see Nicaragua as a strategic threat to the United States and also as a strategic threat to the other Central American countries. And I think it's in our best interest.
That, in your judgment, was one of the overriding reasons why you assumed these risks.
Yes, sir.
And dealt in the way you did with secret and covert actions. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
You said you've had no particular training in this business. You're not trained as an agent or...
No, sir, I was not.
And I assume that at no time have you ever had any association with any intelligence agency. Is that correct?
That's correct.
When you were dealing in all of these sort of furtive and secret ways, what was in your mind about who you were deceiving? Because there was a deception involved here. Who were you deceiving?
I guess in retrospect, that can be answered in a couple ways. Trying to deceive the Sandinistas and the Cubans in the support that we were providing for the Sandinistas, because they obviously have very good intelligence. At the time, obviously Congress had made its decision, I think wrongly, in stopping funds for the effort. And unfortunately, I think in hindsight, the people that we were deceiving may have been the American public. And the reason I think that is because this administration, probably from the very beginning, should have come out and said what it was that it wanted to do, and then carried that out. And I don't think that they did, and I regret that, and I made some mention of that in some of my memos.
So, in addition to the Sandinistas and the Cubans and others outside the country, the secrecy of your actions was designed, in your mind, to deceive the Congress and the country.
Sir, I guess I never looked at it in my mind as trying to deceive anyone. Obviously, that's what happened.
Well, let me just you described going down to the fruit stand in West Side and getting money, taking it to General Secord. Described standing out on the street and handing money to an automobile passenger that drove by. Those were not normal public actions, were they? Hardly.
Sir, we used to joke that truth is always stranger in fiction. In this case, it certainly was
true. You
true.
find yourself somewhat surprised to be in this sort of environment, didn't you?
Quite frankly, when I was approaching the Chinese market, I looked around and I was wondering where the cameras were. I said, this is more a movie set than it is in real life.
Did you find it exciting?
I'm not sure that I found it exciting. It was different.
It was risky? Wasn't it exciting?
What was it that Winston Churchill said? There's nothing quite as exciting as being shot at and having the bullet missed. But
who do you think you might be in risk of being shot by? I don't mean that in a literal sense, but who might have discovered your association and contacts that required this secrecy?
The Sandinistas, there have been several assassination attempts in Costa Rica. The Cubans.
Any in the United States?
I don't know that there weren't any in the United
You
States.
weren't really worried about your security in the United States, or your physical security?
No, I was more concerned about the leak of intelligence that the Cubans and the Soviets, through their intelligence gathering capabilities, can do.
Were you concerned about the press discovering?
Yes, sir.
Were you concerned about congressional investigations discovering?
Obviously, when there's a memo to the effect when GAO came and talked to me, and also when there was an investigation going on in Costa Rica out of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami, I talked to Colonel North about that. So there was a concern.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, and don't agree with this if you don't agree with it, but what I got from your testimony recently is that you thought that you were engaged in an unfortunate deception in the United States from the press, the Congress, and the public, brought upon by necessity to support this cause covertly, and you would have preferred if the administration had been open and public about this matter so that you would not have to deal in this uncharacteristically furtive, secret, and deceptive way. Is that fair?
I think that you summed it up pretty well, sir. I think that if the American people are not behind a policy, then it's very difficult, as we certainly saw in Vietnam and elsewhere, for the policy to take effect and for it to be successful. And I think it is incumbent upon this administration, and President Reagan has gone to the American public on numerous occasions, but I don't think the American public still understand the threat, and I hope that through these hearings and my testimony and other testimonies, that they may begin to realize that in the long term, if Nicaragua is allowed to stay communist, that it will be a threat to the United States in the way, in our lives, in the way we conduct ourselves.
In other words, do you think that, well, let me put it this way, do you think there's also a danger in the development of secret activities of this kind inside the United States?
Sir, I think that there are times when there is a necessity for secrecy, for covert operations. As I said earlier, these were trying times. They were difficult times. People were undertaking an effort that was being kept secret from the Congress and the American people. But I think that the President must have either chosen that course or someone did because of the commitment and the belief that the cause that people were fighting for was right, and that in the long-term interest of the United States that it was appropriate.
So regardless of what the law might be in a technical sense, regardless of what the policy of the country might be at a particular time, you felt that the Contra cause was just and it justified your actions. Is that right?
So I think when the President of the United States goes on national television, I believe it's been some 13 or 14 times to talk specifically about Nicaragua, when he goes on public radio on his noon speeches, when he makes speech after speech and keeps coming back to Congress for assistance, that it was no secret what he believed in. And
do you feel in your heart that the President would have approved these actions if he had known?
Sir, I think you're asking me a question that I'm not sure I can respond to.
Well, you've suggested that part of the reason you felt justified was because the President had clearly laid out this policy and had endorsed it, and that regardless of the technical problems of the law, that was an assurance to you. Is that fair?
Sir, I think that I don't believe that the President would knowingly condone the breaking of laws. I think what really is in question here is two things. One is, were laws broken? And obviously that's for a court to decide. And the second thing is, I guess the bottom line is, who's ultimately responsible for foreign policy? Obviously, as Senator Bourne talked about, you need a joint effort. But there are times when a president has to make decisions that Congress may not want to follow. If you remember back in the Second World War, FDR tried to get the draft and it passed by one vote.
But it was your view, then, that what you did, even though it might be technically illegal, was justified by the President's commitment and yours to this cause?
Sir, I don't know that it was technically illegal.
Yes, I say even though it might be, or might not be.
To use your words, in essence, I was working for a member of the National Security Council. I walked in there, and every time I walked into that building, there was a sense of awe because of what it represents to this country.
So it was Colonel North. It was always Colonel North that gave the directions, and you felt provided the authority for your actions.
I'm not sure that he always gave the directions. He certainly gave me a lot of guidance. But I guess I was under the...
More than any other single person. He
Yes.
was the one that gave the directions and provided the authority.
Yes,
Is that
sir,
right?
more than any other single person. I would just add that, again, going back to the fact that where he stood in government and the people that he talked with and worked with daily, I felt that it was appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman Foley. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Before recessing, I recognize the chairman of the House Committee.
Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record of the hearing at the appropriate point a letter from Dr. William B. Walsh of Project Hope, the Health Science Education Center, which distinguishes that Project Hope from the Project Hope referred to by General Secord.
Without objection, so ordered. The committee will stand in recess until 2 p.m., and at that time, the questioning will be resumed by Congressman Hyde.